cross and what Jesus did on it can be a joke to a lot of people. I remember once when I was a primary school teacher, we used to take the kids up to the local Anglican church for an Easter service. And the kids had learnt some Easter hymns. They'd learnt some of the Easter story. They came back. The staff, we went off for our lunch break straight afterwards. And I walked into the staff room. And there one of the other male teachers in the school was joking around, telling jokes at how morbid the hymns had been that morning, mocking the songs that talked about Jesus bleeding and dying, to the hilarity of the rest of the staff. It's not uncommon, is it? This story just seems like a real joke. That happened quite early as well. One of the earliest depictions of Jesus, it might be even the earliest, I'm not sure, is a piece of graffiti from the 2nd century. A man has drawn a man kneeling in worship to a man on a cross with a donkey for a head. And underneath is written the inscription in Greek, Alexamenos worships his God. What an absolute joke. To worship a God who is crucified. Paul said that when he went across the world, the two biggest groups of people who listened to him, the Jews and the Gentiles, both of them thought that this was foolish. It was stupidity to think that either for a Jew the Messiah had been crucified, or for a Greek that a God would come and be crucified. You know those jokes? They go right back to the very beginning. Because on the cross, all the way through our passage this morning, there is joke after joke at Jesus' expense. Perhaps you come this morning, and whilst I'm sure you'd be more respectful than the people I spoke about in my school staff room, it might seem that the cross is a bit of a joke to you. Or at the very least, it's the part of Christianity that really you struggle to get on board with. Those moral teachings are so encouraging. That picture of Jesus being with you in your darkest place, that's great. And maybe even the picture of heaven. Who could not want that as part of their beliefs about the world? But the idea that God had to come as a man and die for sin, that can be hard to take. And Christians, obviously we love the cross, but in that moment where you're talking to someone about your faith and the cross comes up, do you sometimes feel a bit ashamed at the foolishness that you're describing? Well, the Apostle Paul said when he talked about the foolishness of the cross, that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. When we actually look at the things on the cross that Jesus was mocked for, the things that those Jews, those Greeks, people today found foolishness, we'll actually see the very wisdom of God, what Jesus came to do. We're going to look at three jokes, really, in this story, three ironies. And in those ironies, in those jokes, we'll see that really, God, through what seems like foolishness, is going to bring the world, bring those who know him to salvation. First of all, then, there's the joke of the suffering king. Verse 27. Then the governor's soldiers, that governor is Pilate, by the way. Remember last week he said he didn't want to have anything to do with it? A few minutes later, his soldiers are battering Jesus, but, he's washed his hands of it. Verse 27, then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the Praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers round him. So the Praetorium is the Roman barracks, as it were. A whole company would be 600 soldiers. Now, it's likely some of them would have been out on duty, some of them would have been having a rest or whatever, but whenever I've seen this depicted in a film or a picture, it's generally 4 or 5 Roman soldiers. This is a public humiliation with hundreds of brutal men trying to humiliate Jesus. And the joke is, how pathetic are the Jews that their king can be treated like we're going to treat him now? These soldiers wouldn't have necessarily been Roman. In fact, they're almost certainly not. They would have been auxiliaries, which, if you were listening in your primary school Roman class, was the people from other parts of the empire that were sort of rounded up, press-ganged into service and taken to other parts of the world to serve. So these men would have not wanted to be there, and they would have absolutely despised the Jews for causing them so much trouble in their few years of military service. And so they take everything out upon Jesus. Verse 28. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and they knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spat on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. He's stripped bare in front of this group of violent men. They put one of their Roman robes around his shoulders, which would have been scarlet. You'll know what they look like if you've ever been to Chester. In some of the other Gospels, it says purple. Weirdly, different cultures see colours different ways, and so purple and red in the ancient world they thought of as the same colour. So it was symbolic of a king. But it would have been one of the Roman guards' robes. That would have been all he was wearing. They make a crown out of thorns. You've probably seen the pictures of the crown of thorns, those long thorns that would have been pressed on his head, cutting into his flesh. They gave him a staff, a stick, to pretend to be a scepter. A king held a scepter as a symbol that he wielded authority. But they took that off him. And this man, who, bear in mind, had already been beaten up by the priests in the early hours of the morning, who'd just been whipped, they started to beat him over the head with that staff. They say, "Hail, King of the Jews," what they'd have said to Caesar. "Hail, Caesar." But obviously, this one that they mockingly hail, they don't worship or respect at all. They spit on him and beat him. It's meant to be a joke. It's meant to be the kind of thing that schoolyard bullies do. You call yourself King of the Jews, and yet we can hit you. We can mock you. We can thrust thorns on your head. You are nothing compared to us. What kind of king would suffer? But there's an irony in that irony. Because Jesus came exactly for that reason. He came to be a suffering king. He didn't come to be in a palace. He didn't come to be clothed in a great cloak to have a crown upon his head. No, he came to suffer. He came to be beaten, to be disrespected, to eventually be crucified. Why? Well, on one level, Jesus is able to sympathize with our weaknesses as a result. Many Christians have been through sufferings like Christ's. I knew a man who was from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Some of the things that happened there, he was beaten so badly on his back that the scars still remained and will remain for the rest of his life. There are people, obviously, who have died for Jesus, who've been stripped for Jesus, or for other reasons as well. And for people like that, it's good to know that when they come to God, they come to a God who knows what it is to suffer, a God who became a man. When we were chatting on Thursday night, chatting to a few people afterwards, people start to talk about some of the things they've gone through. It's hard to say God's there for you in that suffering if he's only ever distant in heaven. But we have a God who went to the cross. And so whatever you've been through, I may not have been through it. The people around you may have not been through it. But my goodness, Jesus knows what it is to suffer. And yet there's something deeper than that going on here. It was mentioned in a few of our hymns. I wonder whether you picked it up. That Jesus was suffering in our place. He was a man of sorrows. The punishment we deserve fell upon him. Think about that a bit more in a moment as we come to verses 31 to 38, where we see the next joke. Jesus, the cursed king. It's rather the suffering king, the cursed king now. The joke reaches its fulfillment really in verse 37. Above his head, they place the written charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. This man hanging here crucified is supposed to be your king. That's the joke. That's what everyone was supposed to be laughing at. Jew and Gentile alike. But particularly, part of the joke is that Jesus is being very publicly displayed as cursed by gods. That starts in verse 31. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. Now, I guess there's not many of us in our culture who don't know what crucifixion involves. And the Bible's actually quite subtle because it's not focusing primarily upon the physical sufferings. Now, what is most important about Jesus being crucified is that by the nails in his hands, he is hung on a pole, on a wooden pole. Why does that matter? Well, crucifixion for the Gentiles, for the Romans, this was the worst punishment imaginable. This was the highest of the high. As in the United States, the worst of the worst would be to get the electric chair. Maybe in revolutionary France, it would have been the guillotine. This was the worst punishment you could get. Showed that you were separated off from society. But it was even worse for a Jew. Because in the Jewish law, it said, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. In the past, there were certain crimes in our country that were considered so severe you could not be buried in a churchyard. Now, at that point in history, that was worse than even being hanged or being put to death. Because as your family grieve, they're being told very publicly, your loved one cannot be buried here. The crimes you've committed are so bad that he's not counted amongst the people of God. By symbolizing that he's not going to be buried in the churchyard, we're saying that he's not part of the people of God, that he is suffering in hell right now. That curse was even greater to people of that era than being put to death. And that's basically what being hung on a pole was like for a Jew. People might have debated, is Jesus blessed by God or is he cursed? The teachers of the law say he's cursed, but he seems to be the Son of God. He's doing all these healings. He's doing all these miracles. Surely he must be blessed. But then as they walked into Jerusalem that day, saw him hanging on a pole, they would have told them for absolute certain, no, Jesus must. He must be cursed by God. God would have not allowed this to happen to him unless he were cursed. There's more, that's the deepest, but there is more. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. The reason for that is Jesus is so battered, he can't carry it himself. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. So where's Jesus come from? He's come from Jerusalem, where everyone's celebrating Passover. This is meant to be the day where the people of Israel celebrate that they are God's people. Every Jew should have been within Jerusalem's walls on that day. And yet Jesus is taken out. He's taken out from the people to the place of the skull, the place of death, the place of punishment. And so there's another curse. He's banished from the people of God. He should be inside, but he's sent outside to the place of the skull. Cursed, rejected from the people. He's cursed by no relief. Verse 34. There they offered Jesus wine to drink, mixed with gall. But after tasting it, he refused to drink it. There's probably two reasons Jesus refused this drink. One was that he promised his disciples that he wouldn't drink wine until he came in the second coming. But the second is because they put in gall. Now, there's a little bit of a debate of whether the gall means gall, what gall is, but it seems that whatever it's symbolizing, it was some kind of pain relief. That Jesus would have been on the cross and he'd be in such a state, maybe he'd be hallucinating, whatever, but he wouldn't be able to feel what he was going through. A bit like we try to make people comfortable at the end by giving them drugs. Someone had taken pity on Jesus. Jesus refused to drink it because part of his curse was that he had to drink the cup of God's wrath in full. That he had to experience this death in full. Verse 35, when they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Again, he's stripped. And nakedness is not just something that we all feel a little bit uncomfortable about, but actually nakedness in the scriptures is very much connected to sin. When Adam and Eve were perfect in bliss in the garden, they were naked and not ashamed. But the moment that they sinned, they became ashamed. They wanted to cover themselves up. And so for Jesus to be stripped, for his clothes to be divided, that's a symbol that he is experiencing the shame, the curse of God. Often in the Old Testament prophets, some of you will recognize that theme of being made naked under the wrath of God is used quite frequently. And then he's cursed in the company that he keeps. Verse 38, 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right, one on his left. He's numbered with the criminals. He's classed as one of them. You got sent to prison and you were sitting down and you were eating your dinner with a sex offender on your right and a murderer on your left. You'd no doubt think, what have I come to? What has become of me? That I am classed as one of these people. So it was for Jesus to be crucified with these cursed criminals. So Jesus is cursed by God. He's cursed by being hung on a pole. He's cursed by being banished. He's cursed by having no relief from his pain. He's cursed with nakedness. He's cursed with the company he keeps. But all of that, remember that a curse is not from man to man, but it is from God to man. How can the Son of God be cursed? How can the Father curse his Son? Paul says this in Galatians 3:13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. Paul had been explaining in that passage that all of us deserve a curse for breaking God's law. That we have fallen so short that we deserve to be cursed. And the picture of what that curse is like is in Jesus. We deserve to be cut off. We deserve to be ashamed. We deserve to be banished. We deserve to be hanging and suffering. But Christ wanted to redeem us from the curse of the law. And the only way for that to be done was for him to be cursed. Now, as we see piece of evidence after piece of evidence that he was cursed on that cross, we are being told the curse on us is lifted. It has been paid in full. All the curse that you deserve has been poured out in full on him. If he stepped away from any of this stuff, if he said, you know what, I don't want to be crucified, just cut off my head, that wouldn't have dealt with your curse. If he'd got crucified in Jerusalem rather than banished to the outside, that wouldn't have been taking your curse. But he took it all. He even rejected those painkillers because he knew that he had to be cursed so that your curse could be lifted. So the first joke is the suffering king. The second joke is the cursed king. And the last joke is the unsaved king. We've got to remember that this was a big event. Jerusalem swelled in size to somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million, depending on the year. It was packed. It wasn't that big normally. Think of, New Year's Eve in London and the streets being packed. Or maybe if you're going on the way to a football match and everybody's just kind of walking together. That would have been people from the surrounding areas who'd been staying outside of Jerusalem coming in to visit the temple on this holy day. So Jesus, yes, he's outside the city, but he's certainly not on his own. No crowds would have been coming in. They'd have maybe seen him on Palm Sunday. Maybe they'd have waved their branches, but as they see him on the cross, they realize he's not the Messiah that we thought he is. So what do? They insult him. Verses 39 to 44, we've got really 3 insults. In verse 44, the last one, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. We're not told what those insults were, and we actually know eventually one of those rebels from Luke's gospel ended up trusting in Jesus over the course of the day. But these are the lowest of the low. And they're insulting Jesus. Again, how low is he sunk? Verses 39 to 40, that crowd packing their way into Jerusalem. Verse 39, those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." They're saying, Jesus, you're meant to be powerful. You're going around healing all these people. You said you could destroy a temple and rebuild it in 3 days. If you're powerful, why are you dying? Come down from the cross. You raised the dead. Come down. No, you can't be who you said you were. If God was really your father, he'd rescue you from that cross. Shake their heads and walk by. And then the teachers of the law, the leaders, come. Verse 41. In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the king of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we'll believe him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. As much it's the same as what the crowd say. But there is some interesting extras. With save, you've got to realize that the word for save is the same as the word for heal in the Greek. So there's a bit of a play here. Jesus saved, he healed blind men. He saved and healed deaf men. He saved and healed the dead. He saved and healed people who had demons possessing them. He saved all these people from all their problems. But when it comes to his own salvation, he's helpless. How pathetic, they say. And yet, in a sense, because these are the teachers of Israel, what they say is actually completely true. He saved others, but he can't save himself. You know what? That's the very nature of what Jesus came to do on the cross. He wanted to save others. He wanted to rescue them from their curse. But to save others, he couldn't save himself. He couldn't come down from the cross. He couldn't ease the suffering in any way. If he was going to save others, if he was going to save you, he couldn't save himself. What do we do with this then? Well, let me first talk to those of you who don't know Jesus or who are in the process of trying to figure out what this is all about. Firstly, for those of you who are interested in the kind of historical thing, there's lots of people, if you talk about this on the internet, they'll say, oh, Jesus is a fairy tale, no such man existed. Actually, there's good evidence not only that Jesus existed, but that he died. Not only in the Bible, but in outside sources. mentioned that piece of graffiti at the beginning. There's reports from Roman historians, from Jewish historians, that there was a guy called Jesus who was thought to be a Messiah, who was crucified. Some of them even say at the Passover, so they even get the day right. We're more certain that Jesus died at Passover than we are of many of the events in ancient Roman history. No really serious historical scholar debates whether Jesus existed, nor whether Jesus died. So it's interesting that such an ignominious person who had suffered this ignominious death in a few hundred years was the most worshipped person in the world. That's something to take account of. That's something to examine. Some of you maybe examine that. Maybe you think that Jesus perhaps is who he says he is. But what does this tell you? If you want to come to Jesus, you first of all have to come to terms with the seriousness of sin, so that you could be forgiven. All this had to happen to Jesus. All of it. And you might look and you might say, okay, I've fallen short. I'm not perfect, but this is just too much. You and I, we just don't grasp how serious sin is. We need this picture to show us. You know, sometimes when my kids are being naughty, I come to them and I say, you know, what's gone on? And one of them's hit the other. I say, you can't hit your sister or your brother. Well, she did this, he did this. No. You're going to have to sit on the naughty step now for a certain number of minutes. And why do I do that? Because what you've done is serious. You don't think it's serious, but hitting your brother and sister is so serious that you need to have punishment like this. Through that punishment, I'm teaching them how serious their sin is. God, this morning, showing us what Jesus went through, showing us how serious sin is. We may think it's pretty bad. We may think it's a fault, a failing. God says it deserves to be cursed. And until we recognize that it was my sin that nailed him there, until we recognize that we deserve the wrath of God, I can't understand the cross. So I urge you this morning, maybe go home, maybe in the quietness of this afternoon if you get any, or maybe this evening, go through what you've done and acknowledge that you deserved what came on Jesus. And then secondly, this shows us that we need the cross of Jesus. It's not a bit that we could just cut out of the story because it's not relevant for the 21st century people. It is absolutely vital. If we are to be saved, we can't save Jesus from this cross. We can't get rid of this. For you to be saved, you must trust that Jesus died for your sin. You must accept him as your Savior. And if you do that, that sin is completely paid for. And I bring the Christians in at this point because Christians, sometimes we look at our sin and we say, okay, maybe God could forgive me when I was 14 years old and the worst thing that I'd ever done was, not obey my parents. But now all of these things that I've done since becoming a Christian, how could God ever forgive me? And maybe some of you are in the process of thinking through whether you're a Christian. You think, but how could God ever forgive someone like me? And the answer is the only way he could do that is through the cross. But the cross happened. If Jesus really did go through all of these curses, all of this suffering, at every point completing what God asked him to do, it would be a crime for God to not forgive you. Your punishment has been paid. Jesus has paid it in full. He's already been cursed. He's already suffered. There is nothing else to pay. It's like going to the bank to say, what do I have to do to pay my debts? And the bank is saying, somebody's rang up and paid it all already. You don't need to worry. Not because you're so great, not because your sin is not as big as you thought it was, Because Jesus has already been cursed and has paid the full price for your sin. And so it doesn't matter how bad things get. It doesn't matter how ashamed you are in your past. The shame will never fall on you. Shame has fallen on him. Lastly, to Christians, we talked at the beginning about how sometimes in our world the cross can be a cause of shame. Many of us can be ashamed of this brutal, medieval-seeming method of torture. I think we've just got to get used to the fact shame goes with the territory. Like Simon of Cyrene had to carry Jesus' cross, Jesus earlier in the Gospels said, "Take up your cross and follow me." There will be shame for following Jesus. There'll be shame in having to say certain things are wrong, certain things are right. There'll be shame in having to express that you are a sinner. There'll be shame in having to talk about a man who was crucified as if it's the most important thing in the world. But that's a shame that we've got to take. And why wouldn't we? Because that minor shame that we might experience is nothing compared to the shame he had as he hung on that cross and took God's curse for us. So we'll boldly go out. We'll proclaim that Jesus has saved us. We will not, as Paul said, be ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God to those who are being saved. Let's just close with a moment's quiet. Why don't you, in the quiet, pray to God in your mind. Maybe you'd be praying, God, if this is true, pray that you'd show it to me. Maybe you'd pray forgiveness of sin. Maybe you'd want to pray to be willing to bear the shame of the cross. Why don't you take some moments now to bring this passage before the Lord and ask him to help it root into your heart. And then we're going to sing How Deep the Father's Love and praise Jesus for what we see here.